Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm John Townsend and we'll be starting a short series on rice pudding. Today we'll be working on the rich version. Thanks for joining us. Rice puddings are very popular in the 18th century cookbooks, whether they're English or the cookbook we'll be using today. You'll find multiple recipes. So today we might open up a recipe book and we'll find one or maybe two rice pudding recipes. But if you look in these old cookbooks, they'll have 3, 4, or in the case of today's cookbook, Amelia Simmons's little tiny American Cookery cookbook, it's got 6 different versions of rice pudding in it. So I picked out one that was the sort of fanciest one, and later on we'll be doing the one that she calls a cheap one. But today we'll be working on this rich version of a rice pudding. Let's get started. Let's talk about the rice number 1. This is rice pudding. We're using recipe number 4 in Amelia Simmons's cookbook. And recipe number 4 starts off with boil in water a half a pound of ground rice. Now, if you're in the UK, this might ring a bell with you, ground rice. Here where we are, ground rice, you can say that, and we have no idea exactly what is meant by ground rice. Does that mean flour, like rice flour? Or does it mean sort of partially ground? Or does it mean something different, even like polished rice? It could mean a lot of different things. Well, apparently in this context, ground rice in this period, and still is in the UK, sort of a partially ground rice. Granulated, I guess might be another word. Not pulverized, not turned into a flour, but sort of half ground. And here in the United States, the closest thing we've got to that is cream of rice that you can find in the grocery store. At least I can find it in my local grocery store. And this is sort of a, I don't know, rice ground up into, say, maybe a fifth of its normal size, but not into powder. That's what we're going to be using for this episode, or for this particular recipe. So for the next step, we're going to take our ground rice and we're going to put it in, we're going to actually boil it in milk. And we have to boil this really slowly. I've halved this recipe, so here I've got 4 ounces of this ground rice, and in our cooking vessel here, I've got 1 quart of milk. And I'll just take this in, and I'm gonna take this over the fire, and we're gonna heat it up and slowly cook it while stirring it so that it doesn't turn into one big clump. So let's get this on the fire. Our mixture is off the fire. It's really nice and thick at this point. You can see how thick it is. It's got still got a lot of heat into it. One of the next ingredients here is butter. And since we want it to get mixed in nicely, we're gonna put the butter in while this is still warm, although we're gonna let it cool off. I've got 3 ounces of butter, and we'll put this in, get it mixed up. And I'm gonna set this aside for a few minutes to melt the butter and to cool off a little bit. So let's come back in a second. So our mixture's cooled off enough now that we can start to mix in our other ingredients. We can put in 3 eggs. These have been whisked up nicely. Let's put in some salt, probably about a teaspoon or so. This recipe also calls for the expensive versions of the spices that would go in one of these. So we've got nutmeg, of course. This one, she calls for an entire small nutmeg to be put into that. This is a half recipe, so I don't need quite that much nutmeg, but yep, we got some good nutmeg in there. Some cinnamon. That's another one of these expensive spices that go in this. So we've got some cinnamon here. Most of the recipes call for some sort of sweetener. In this one, the sweetener is raisins. The recipe calls for a full pound. We're gonna put in a half pound because of the half recipe. Now for this fancy version of the rice pudding, we're doing something a little special. We've got a puff paste in a pie pan, and we're gonna go ahead and just put our filling in here. We don't want to overfill it too much because it might grow out. and cause us trouble. I think that's probably about enough. I could probably do another little mini pie or a mini pudding with what's left over here. Okay, and since this is one that's a little fancier, let's go ahead and put some puff paste decoration up on top. So there it is, it's all decorated. It's time for it to go in the oven. You'll probably bake this at a typical 350 degrees. The recipe calls for 2 hours. This one might not take quite as long as that, but let's get it in the oven. We'll watch it and see just exactly how long it takes. Here is our fancy, our well-to-do rice pudding. Definitely has lots of different ingredients in it, the expensive ingredients, the puff paste, the everything else. Let's see what it tastes like. Well, this one is very thick and rich. Because the rice is finer grained here, it's much, the consistency is very kind of thick throughout. So a very interesting texture and a good one. Of course, I love it with the raisins in it. The raisins are perfect in here. And having that crust, that whole puff paste, really kind of sets it up another notch and makes it look very beautiful compared to other kinds of rice puddings that, you know, just kind of cook up in a pot. They don't look quite like this one does. This one's got a wonderful flavor. The kind of complexity of flavors and the raisins and the looks of it, that it's definitely for a bit more of a well-to-do table than a standard rice pudding that might come. So even then, even at this, it's not a very expensive dish. And obviously it's showing up in this American Cookery cookbook. And it's not really filled with really expensive things. This is down-home cooking in this cookbook. This is just fancier version of that same thing. So a wonderful recipe, really still very easy to pull off. Takes a couple little extra steps and has several more ingredients than your typical rice pudding, but still just a great recipe. Be sure to tune in next week. This is the rich version of the rice pudding. Next week, I'll be doing the simplest one out of the cookbook. As she calls it, the cheap one or a cheap one. It'll be an interesting contrast between this rice pudding and that one. I have so much fun experimenting with these things and testing them out, you know, looking through Amelia Simmons's little American Cookery cookbook. So much fun digging into the history of food, connecting them up with what we eat today, understanding the roots of the food we eat today. So much fun. And I get so much encouragement from the channel, everyone in the comment section and watching the videos. I really want to thank you all for your great support. And I want to thank you for coming along today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.